November 5th, 1943. A Japanese pilot climbs into his Zero at Rabaul, Japan's strongest fortress in the Pacific. His hands shake, not from fear, but exhaustion. Above him, the sky darkens with American planes, unstoppable, unending. Rabaul was supposed to be impregnable, the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific. But in just 10 days, it would become something else entirely. A fortress turned prison, and Japan's greatest mistake. How did the Allies turn Japan's greatest stronghold into its greatest trap? If you want to dive deeper into World War II's most fascinating battles, hit that subscribe button right now. Let me take you back to early 1942. The Japanese war machine is unstoppable. Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, one victory after another. And on January 23rd, Japanese forces land at Rabaul, a small town on the northeastern tip of New Britain Island, overwhelming the small Australian garrison defending it. But here's what made Rabaul different from every other conquest. Its location was pure strategic gold. Imagine a natural harbor so deep, so protected, that entire fleets could hide there. Add to that 5 airfields, and you've got yourself the perfect staging ground for every operation in the South Pacific. From Rabaul, Japanese planes could reach Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and even threaten the supply lines between America and Australia. The Japanese knew what they had. They poured resources into Rabaul like water into a bathtub. By 1943, over 110,000 troops were stationed there. Soldiers, sailors, pilots, and construction crews. They carved miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock, creating underground cities that could withstand any bombing raid. They installed 367 anti-aircraft guns, ranging from machine guns to heavy cannons. They built barracks, supply depots, and repair facilities, everything an army needs to wage war. Allied pilots had a nickname for it, the Hornet's Nest. And they weren't exaggerating. Every plane that approached Rabaul faced a storm of steel. The Japanese had some of their best pilots stationed there, flying the deadly Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies since the war began. Simpson Harbor, the main anchorage, became known as the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific, not because of what happened there, but because of what could happen from there. Did you know? The Japanese were so confident in Rabaul's defenses that they used it as their primary forward operating base for over 18 months. Every major operation in the region, every attack, every reinforcement, every supply run went through Rabaul. It wasn't just a base, it was the beating heart of Japan's South Pacific Empire. Here's something to think about. When you pour all your resources into making one place absolutely impregnable, are you creating strength or creating a single point of failure? Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Can a fortress ever be too strong for its own good? With the Gibraltar of the Pacific secured, the Allies had opened the gate. Now comes the next move. Operation Cartwheel, the plan to tighten the noose around Japan's Pacific Empire. By mid-1943, the war had shifted. Guadalcanal had fallen to the Americans after 6 months of brutal fighting. The Japanese were retreating across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. The question wasn't whether the Allies would go after Rabaul. It was how. General Douglas MacArthur wanted to smash right through it, a direct assault, overwhelming force, take the base and use it for Allied operations. But when military planners looked at the numbers, reality hit hard. Rabaul had more defenders than Okinawa would have 2 years later. The casualties would be catastrophic. Thousands of American and Australian lives lost storming beaches fortified with concrete bunkers and pre-sighted artillery. Then, someone asked a different question. What if we don't attack it at all? This was revolutionary thinking. Instead of destroying Rabaul, what if they simply made it irrelevant? Cut off its supply lines, neutralize its air power, and leave those 110,000 troops to sit there while the war moved on without them. It was like bypassing a castle instead of laying siege to it, bold, unconventional, and potentially brilliant. Operation Cartwheel was born from this strategy. The plan involved a two-pronged advance: MacArthur pushing through New Guinea and western New Britain from the southwest, while Admiral Bull Halsey drove up through the Solomon Islands from the southeast. Picture two arms closing around Rabaul, not to crush it, but to isolate it completely. The operation kicked off on June 30th, 1943. Woodlark and Kirawina Islands fell quickly, unopposed landings that gave the Allies crucial airfield positions. New Georgia took longer, over a month of savage jungle fighting. But with each island captured, with each new airstrip built, Allied planes moved closer to Rabaul. The noose was tightening inch by bloody inch. Here's what made this strategy brilliant. It played to Allied strengths. America had shipyards churning out escort carriers faster than Japan could build anything. They had pilot training programs that could replace losses. They had fuel, supplies, and logistics networks that stretched from California to the Southwest Pacific. Japan had none of these advantages. By October, Allied forces were hammering Rabaul from newly captured bases. Bougainville, the largest island in the Solomon chain, was next, only 200 miles from Rabaul at its narrowest point, close enough that land-based bombers could reach it. The stage was set for something unprecedented. But as the noose tightened around Rabaul, the Japanese Admiralty faced a crisis. How do you defend a fortress when the enemy refuses to attack it directly? Their answer would prove to be one of the most catastrophic decisions of the Pacific War. With Operation Cartwheel underway and Japan's Pacific defenses reeling, the stage was set for a bold, fateful move. The next chapter would reveal the fatal decision that stripped the fleet and changed the course of the war. Admiral Menechi Koga faced an impossible choice in late October 1943. Allied forces had just landed at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville. If they established themselves there, Rabaul would be under constant attack. He needed air superiority, and he needed it immediately. So Koga made a decision that would haunt Japan for the rest of the war. He ordered Operation Roe, the transfer of nearly every carrier-based aircraft from the combined fleet at Truk to Rabaul. We're talking about 173 elite carrier planes, 82 Zero fighters, 45 dive bombers, and 40 torpedo bombers. These weren't just aircraft. They were crewed by the most experienced naval aviators Japan had, survivors of Pearl Harbor, veterans of the Coral Sea, pilots who'd fought at Midway. Think about what this meant. Aircraft carriers without aircraft are just expensive floating targets. Koga was gambling everything on Rabaul, stripping his fleet bare to reinforce a base that was already under siege. On paper, it looked like strength. Rabaul's 11th Air Fleet now had nearly 400 aircraft. In reality, he'd just fed his best pilots into a meat grinder. The Japanese called it the sinkhole in the Bismarcks. Pilots knew what awaited them. Every sortie faced overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters. Every mission ran the risk of being intercepted by American planes that had radar guidance and superior coordination. The Zero, once the undisputed master of Pacific skies, was now facing newer American fighters like the F-6F, Hellcat, and F-4U Corsair, planes specifically designed to counter its strengths. When Admiral Halsey learned about the Japanese carrier planes at Rabaul, he didn't panic. He saw opportunity. Those elite pilots were concentrated in one place, flying from land bases instead of carriers. They couldn't maneuver their base like a ship. They couldn't retreat across open ocean. They were sitting ducks. Well-trained, dangerous sitting ducks, but trapped nonetheless. Did you know? Japan's pilot training program was incredibly selective, but also incredibly slow. They couldn't replace losses at anywhere near the rate America could. Every veteran pilot lost was irreplaceable, and Koga had just put them all in the crosshairs. The Allies just needed one thing, a chance to strike hard enough to break them. That chance came on November 5th, 1943. And what happened next would shock even the most optimistic American commanders. With the fleet weakened by this fatal decision, the focus now shifts to dawn strike, November 5th, 1943, where the battle would take a dramatic and decisive turn. Picture this. It's 4:30 a.m. on November 5th. The carriers USS Saratoga and USS Princeton are steaming north through darkness, hiding behind a weather front. On their decks, 97 aircraft are being prepped for launch, every plane available. Not a single fighter held back for defensive patrol. Admiral Frederick Sherman was betting everything on surprise. This was insane by conventional standards. Carrier doctrine demanded keeping fighters back to protect the ships. But Sherman understood something crucial. Rabaul was the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. Half measures wouldn't work. You either went all in or you didn't go at all. As dawn broke, American planes roared toward Rabaul. The pilots could see Simpson Harbor packed with warships, cruisers, destroyers, support vessels. 7 heavy cruisers sat in the harbor, freshly arrived to bombard the Bougainville beachhead. If those ships reached the landing zones, they could massacre the Marines trapped on the beaches. The Japanese weren't expecting carrier aircraft. Land-based Army Air Force bombers? Sure. But Navy planes from carriers? Rabaul was too well defended for that kind of risk. The surprise was total. American dive bombers screamed down through clouds of anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo bombers came in low, skimming the waves. Fighters tangled with Japanese Zeros overhead, dogfighting at speeds that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. The sky became a chaos of tracer fire, explosions, and burning aircraft spiraling into the sea. One American torpedo bomber took a hit from a Zero. The photographer aboard, Paul Barnett, kept shooting pictures even as the Japanese fighter made a head-on attack. He captured the moment before it killed him. The pilot, Commander Henry Caldwell, brought the crippled plane back to Saratoga, landing on one wheel with no flaps, no ailerons, and no radio. When they pulled Barnett's body from the plane, his camera was still clutched in his hands. By the time American planes headed home, 6 of those 7 Japanese cruisers were damaged, 4 of them severely. 1 hour later, Army Air Force B-24 Liberators arrived with P-38 escorts, pounding Rabaul again before the Japanese could catch their breath. The 1-2 punch left the harbor shrouded in smoke, with burning ships listing in the water. Japanese pilots scrambled to respond, but they were disorganized, low on fuel, and facing aircraft that kept coming in waves. By day's end, Japan had lost not just ships but something more precious, the illusion of invincibility. Rabaul wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. The shockwaves of dawn strike left the enemy reeling, but the struggle was far from over. Next, we move into the sinkhole, bleeding dry, where losses would mount and resources would be stretched to the breaking point. After November 5th, Rabaul became a magnet for destruction. 6 days later, on November 11th, 3 more American carriers arrived: USS Essex, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Independence, launching a coordinated strike that left the harbor looking like a scrapyard. The cruiser Agano took a torpedo hit. The destroyer Suzunami blew up while loading torpedoes, taking 148 sailors with her. But here's what made this truly devastating. The losses weren't just in ships, they were in people. Pilots who'd survived years of combat were dying in droves. Japan had trained these men for years, selecting only the best and teaching them every trick of aerial combat. There was no fast-track program, no shortcuts. Each pilot represented thousands of hours of training, and they were being thrown away defending a base that Allied strategists had already decided to bypass. The air battles over Rabaul in November 1943 were apocalyptic. During one 2-week period, the 1st Air Squadron lost 43 of 82 Zero fighters, 38 of 45 dive bombers, and 34 of 40 torpedo bombers. That's over half their strength. Gone. Allied fighters shot them down in flames, anti-aircraft fire chewed them apart, and even pilots who survived crash landings often had nowhere to land safely. Japanese commanders started calling it what it was: a death sentence. Pilots received orders to Rabaul the way soldiers once received orders to hold positions to the last man. The base had become a black hole, sucking in aircraft and men and spitting out nothing but losses. By December, Rabaul's air strength was a shadow of what it had been. The elite carrier pilots, most were dead or wounded. The planes, shot down or too damaged to fly. The supplies, running low as Allied submarines picked off transport ships. The tunnel networks that once seemed so secure became tombs for men who couldn't evacuate. Did you know? The Japanese lost more experienced carrier pilots at Rabaul in 2 months than they'd lost in the entire first year of the war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was so one-sided, partly because Japan's best pilots were already dead, killed over Rabaul, trying to defend a base that no longer mattered. And while Rabaul bled itself dry in the skies, something even more devastating was happening on the ground and at sea. The trap wasn't just closing, it was about to slam shut forever. As the enemy bled dry in the sinkhole, their options dwindled and vulnerabilities deepened. This set the stage for the trap closes, isolated and forgotten, where isolation would turn into a deadly advantage. While Rabaul bled itself dry, MacArthur and Halsey kept moving. On December 15th, American troops landed at Rabaul in western New Britain. On December 26th, the 1st Marine Division hit Cape Gloucester. These weren't attacks on Rabaul itself, they were flanking moves, cutting off escape routes and establishing new airfields even closer to the Japanese stronghold. Picture what this meant for the defenders. Every day, more Allied planes appeared overhead. B-24 Liberators dropped tons of bombs on the airfields, cratering runways and destroying aircraft on the ground. Marine Corsairs strafed anything that moved. Australian and New Zealand squadrons joined the attacks, making Rabaul's skies a constant war zone. Japanese ships couldn't resupply the base without running a gauntlet of submarines and air attacks. Even small barges sneaking along the coast were hunted down and sunk. Food supplies dwindled, medicine ran out, ammunition stocks dropped. The 110,000 troops at Rabaul were still armed, still dangerous, still ready to fight. But they had no one to fight. The war had literally moved past them. By March 1944, the Allied advance reached the Admiralty Islands. That was it. The trap had closed completely. Rabaul was now surrounded by Allied bases, cut off from Japan by thousands of miles of enemy-controlled ocean. No supplies coming in, no reinforcements, no hope of evacuation. Think about the psychology of this. You're a Japanese soldier at Rabaul. Your home is thousands of miles away. Your empire is losing battle after battle. You're sitting on an island with months, maybe years, of war still ahead. And you know, everyone knows, that you've been written off. Abandoned. Your commanders in Tokyo have decided you're not worth the cost of rescuing. The Allies kept bombing Rabaul throughout 1944 and into 1945, but it was almost perfunctory. Training missions for new pilots, target practice. The base wasn't a threat anymore. It was just there, rotting away under the tropical sun and endless air raids. When MacArthur declared victory over Rabaul in February 1944, the base technically still held over 100,000 Japanese troops. He won without defeating them. He won by making them irrelevant. But what does irrelevant mean when you're one of those 100,000 men? For the defenders of Rabaul, the real battle was just beginning. A battle not against bullets and bombs, but against time, starvation, and the crushing weight of abandonment. With the trap closing and forces isolated, defeat became inevitable. Now, the story moves to the end, surrender without battle, where the culmination of strategy and attrition would bring the conflict to a quiet but decisive conclusion. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice crackles through radio speakers across Japan, announcing surrender. At Rabaul, roughly 69,000 Japanese troops listened in stunned silence. Thousands more had already died from starvation, disease, and relentless Allied bombing raids that never stopped. The survivors had been holding Rabaul for 3 long years since isolation began. When Australian forces arrived to accept the surrender, they found a ghost fortress. The massive tunnel networks were still intact, but empty. Artillery pieces rusted in emplacements that hadn't fired a single shot in years. Supplies lay moldering in warehouses, uniforms, weapons, and equipment for an army that no longer existed. Rabaul hadn't fallen in some climactic battle. It had simply been forgotten until the war ended. The irony was brutal. Japan had poured enormous resources into building Rabaul into an impregnable fortress. They'd sacrificed their best carrier pilots trying to defend it, and in the end, none of it mattered. The Allies bypassed it, isolated it, and let nature do the rest. Those 110,000 troops might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did Japan's war effort. It took the Allies over 2 years to repatriate all the surviving Japanese soldiers from Rabaul, 2 years to process prisoners of war who had never actually fought in a battle, just wasted away on an island that was supposed to be their empire's strongest shield. The fall of Rabaul changed modern warfare. It proved that destruction wasn't always necessary, that sometimes isolation was more effective than invasion. Sometimes the smartest move wasn't to attack the fortress, but to walk around it and let it die on its own. Think about what this meant strategically. Instead of losing tens of thousands of men storming Rabaul's defenses, the Allies lost relatively few while achieving the same goal. Those saved lives went on to fight in other battles, liberate other islands, and ultimately win the war. The troops that could have been tied down besieging Rabaul were free to push toward the Philippines, toward Iwo Jima, toward Japan itself. Did you know? When volcanic eruptions buried most of Rabaul in 1994, it felt almost poetic. The fortress Japan built to last forever, the one the Allies never actually captured, was finally destroyed by nature itself, just like the strategy that defeated it 5 decades earlier. Those 100,000 Japanese troops didn't lose in 10 days of fighting. They lost in 10 days of decisions by Allied commanders to bypass instead of attack, to isolate instead of invade, to turn Japan's greatest fortress into its greatest prison. Their defeat didn't come with explosions or gunfire. It came slowly, over months and years, as they starved on an island their own command had already abandoned. If you want to see how American Sherman tank radios revolutionized armored warfare and shocked German commanders, check out the video on your screen right now.